What you are about to hear is really fascinating. We have so far researched for you possible answers to these big questions: who, where, when, and how the strange events might have occurred in Rendlesham Forest. But so far, we have not solved the big mystery: why? An engineer named Winston Keech wrote a report claiming the British Ministry of Defence and the United States Defence Department used advanced military physics laboratories in the Rendlesham Forest area to deorbit and land a Soviet spy satellite on British soil. If Winston Keech's report is true, it exposes a fascinating secret history from the Cold War. In this film, James Worrow, science researcher, Simon Holland, science filmmaker, and John Burroughs, retired US Air Force and Rendlesham Forest witness, share their research and scientific knowledge and recount memories from the Rendlesham Forest incident to assess if Winston Keech's satellite theory might be true.
These things are real, they're here, this is happening now.
There has been and is an existing presence. You don't have to go anywhere.
You can find it here.
Yeah.
Our night that we went out there, they were blasting the phenomenon with EM frequencies. Because those blue lights that we saw, plasma's being targeted by lasers.
Yeah.
They got immediately merged into UFOs, and I'm not sure what UFOs are, but these aren't spacecraft. These aren't extraterrestrial.
High-power radars and ionospheric heaters are capable of making atmospheric plasmas. They may be swept across the sky in regular or intelligent patterns.
We have now released Land Quick Strike. Repeat, we have now released Land Quick Strike.
Welcome everybody to another fascinating episode with the Rendlesham Forest investigation team. Tonight we have a very interesting report written by Winston Keech, who's an engineer in the UK with lots of experience, and he's talking about the why something went on possibly at Rendlesham Forest with his report about downing a Soviet spy satellite onto UK soil.
I met Winston in 2010 for the 30th anniversary. He came down, brought his equipment down. We analyzed the area on infrared cameras. We got some anomalies on them in the area where we had our activity and a high reading of VM frequencies. So when I was going to return back in 2018, he agreed to come down and do a complete site survey, including the fact that we walked the whole area from beginning to end with his equipment. And after that, he put a complete report together based off of what we did when we were both times in 10 and in 18, and some other information that he had available to himself. And he put together this great report, and we agreed to allow the report to be put in the Weaponization of UAP book that we published.
John Burroughs had an early cut of the film that you're about to see. Who did you send it to, and what was his reaction?
Well, for starters, I sent Winston Keech's report that he did in 2018 to Colonel Hall, and he had quite an interesting response. And then this latest film that I sent to Colonel Hall, he also came back immediately with the response.
To start, we shared this report with Deputy Base Commander Charles Holt. This is what he said. A most interesting article, some of which makes a lot of sense. Yes, the Russians did lose a satellite about that time frame, and we did have a classified plane make an emergency landing about then, but it was ours. Winston Keech report. Is there a single definitive answer for the events in Rendlesham Forest around Christmas 1980? I don't think so. It seems clear that there was a convergence of events and that the situation there was complex. The evidence points to at least three things happening at that time and at three different levels of understanding, This is not intended to be a definitive answer. It is my examination of technical possibilities surrounding the event from the perspective of a multidiscipline engineer. The first is the everyday practical level. This aspect has been well defined by other researchers, so will not be covered in my report, other than to comment that, yes, there are factors here that play into the sequence of events, but they create noise that is obscuring some more interesting and less understood aspects. Focusing on the scientific and engineering considerations that must underpin the evidence, it seems probable that at least two unusual things occurred. The first intentional and of an internationally sensitive nature, the second may have been unexpected by those carrying out the first. If so, it would have been on the then cutting edge of mainstream science, and even today, to the man in the street, likely to be considered within the realms of science fiction.
Basically, the Strategic Defence Initiative was intended to defend the United States from attack from the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles by intercepting them at various phases of their flight. For the interception, the Strategic Defence Initiative required very extremely advanced technological systems. Among the potential components of the defence systems were both space and Earth-based laser battle stations, which by a combination of methods apparently would direct their killing beams towards moving Soviet targets. Air-based missile platforms and ground-based missiles using other non-nuclear killing mechanisms would constitute the rear echelon of defence and would be concentrated around major targets such as US ICBM silos. The sensors that would detect attacks will be based on the ground and in the air and in space, and they would use radar, optical and infrared threat detection systems.
We were the largest tech fighter wing in the Air Force. Our mission was to stop tanks coming across from Russia into NATO. The base was new for that mission. We were training a lot for it, so there was a keen interest on our location based on the fact that we not only had the A-10, which was new to the theater, and we also had other resources.
Question: would an intentional action of an internationally sensitive nature during the Cold War spur the Soviets into a more defensive mindset? Project Ryan was instigated in the Soviet Union only 2 months after the Rendlesham incidents. Project Ryan was a KGB lead program to anticipate a nuclear missile attack on the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1981, the KGB operated a worldwide intelligence network to monitor indicators and assess the likelihood of a surprise nuclear missile attack launched by NATO. The loss of Soviet recon satellites over NATO bases might have also put the Soviets on the back foot in any attempt to monitor our own potential nuclear activities.
John has been seeking answers for over 40 years to what actually happened to himself and others at Rendlesham Forest. Without a doubt, the British government knew all about the incident, even mentioning it in the MOD Condign report, citing injuries to UASF or service personnel. And even Prime Minister Thatcher, at the time when asked questions about Rendlesham, knew all about it, saying, "It wasn't aliens, and you can't tell the people." What exactly she meant by that has been lost to history. But John Burroughs and his lawyer got a clearer answer to that question by filing a Freedom of Information request to the US State Department, who would have been involved if there had been an international incident.
Well, as far as the Freedom of Information Act goes, Pat Frasconia, when I was trying to get my settlement, did a whole slew of Freedom of Informations to every alphabet soup agency in the United States government and also the State Department. The State Department responded back and stated the following, that they held documents on the incident, which then would mean it was an international incident, because when you're overseas, anything that happens intergovernment-wise goes through the Department of State, and they handle whatever needs to be done with it. But what they wouldn't do is release the documents to us, because the gaining unit was United States Air Force. And they recommended, we contacted the Air Force. When we did, the Air Force denied any knowledge of any such documents. As far as Brenda Butler goes, Winston Keech actually talked with her a lot more than I did over the years. And I believe that's where he got some of his information from. But I will add one other tidbit. There was some stuff that was never made public until after a couple of OSI agents came forward. One of them that wasn't there, one of them that was clearly there, that was vetted by Colonel Hall himself, who said, yes, he was involved in the case, who stated that there was an interaction with the foreign countries' agents during the event. That was never made public until the OSI agents themselves confirmed that. So there definitely was some kind of interaction going along. Plus, there also was another interaction where the 67th whistleblower came forward and talked a little bit about the 67th's involvement with recovering the down satellite and also transporting it up to Scotland. Plus, on night 2, when I was on the gate around dusk, the helicopter lifted something out of the forest, which probably was what damaged the runway lights that was later reported and transported over by the 67th area.
The Zenit 6U, also known as Argon or 11F645, was a Soviet optical reconnaissance satellite of the Vostok-based Zenit family to replace the earlier Zenit 2M, Gektor, Zenit 4M, Rotor, Zenit 4MK, Hermes, and Zenit 4MKM, Gerakl series. Zenit 6U was used for both low-altitude, high-resolution missions and higher-altitude area surveillance missions. The satellites consisted of the Vostok-based service and re-entry modules and featured an additional maneuvering engine, which was jettisoned before re-entry. The spherical re-entry module returned both the cameras and the film to Earth at the end of the mission. The lifetime of the battery-powered spacecraft was typically 12 to 14 days. Capturing a Zenit 6 satellite would have been a great boon for NATO forces at the time, as it would have given an accurate view of Soviet satellite capabilities.
The Soviet Union and allies all spied on each other, and at the time they were using satellites. Now, a satellite in high orbit is high up and everything on the Earth is a long way away. One of the best ways to look at the Earth closely is in LEO, low Earth orbit. You can have telephoto lens. At the time it was large format film, and this Soviet series of satellites were only about 286 kilometers above the Earth. They were in the upper atmosphere. That means that their mission only lasted a few days, but they were launching these things every month, just about. You have to understand that this was very, very much a target that was being watched by the United States and the UK. We didn't want their Cosmos satellites flying over us in polar orbits. So, James, tell us more about the Cosmos satellite program.
It's massive. The program was massive, and there was many different types of satellites that were being used and upgraded every time they used to put them in orbit. But the one we focused on because of the time period was a Zenit 6U satellite. Now, we know that this was used for sort of both low altitude, high resolution missions, and it also higher altitude areas for surveillance missions. Thing is, these satellites, they consisted of what they called a Vostok-based service and re-entry modules. And what was different about these was the fact that they actually had an additional maneuvering engine. And this engine could be jettisoned before re-entry. The spherical re-entry module, which at the time, what the United States and the British were doing, their version of that was literally being able to release camera footage. Then they had to fly an aircraft to literally pick it up in a big net while it was coming down from the sky, which was, a little bit behind what the Russians were actually attempting or actually achieving at the time. As I said, the spherical re-entry module that had the cameras and the films and everything, that would be jettisoned somewhere else.
But how could you capture one without outraging the Soviets at a time of huge tensions? Here is how I think you might do it. You would use your most powerful space tracking radar to deliver a massive energy pulse, powerful enough to stun the electronics inside the satellite. To the Soviets, this would just appear to be a system failure of the type that can happen at any time. Solar wind, component failure, space debris impact, all can do this and do. What radar would be powerful enough? The AN/FPS-49 at RAF Fylingdales certainly would. You would need to take one of the 3 dishes off its missile launch spotting duties to do so though, and you would have to reprogram the pulse duration cycles of the klystrons feeding that dish. It had multiple klystrons that fed their outputs into combinational waveguides to feed the antennas. As a backup plan, or instead of one of NORAD's primary space radars, you might want to use the equally powerful FGAN system in Germany, known as TIRA, Tracking and Imaging Radar. This is a huge and very powerful space tracking radar that can operate within several wavebands. Its upper operating frequency is much higher than other comparable radars. At the low end of the terahertz band, upper end of the microwave band. This is so the wavelength is very short so that it can take radar images that are almost photograph-like, even several thousand miles away. You now have a very high-speed flying brick. How do you bring it down where you want it to land? You track it as accurately as you can whilst you slam on the air brakes in a controlled fashion every time it passes you in its orbit. This may sound like science fiction, but locally, raising sections of the atmosphere is exactly what atmospheric heaters are designed to do. They heat and raise the ionosphere very precisely using phased array radio transmitters of huge power. But HAARP was not online for another 13 years, I hear you say. Well, correct, but it didn't need to be. There was a pre-existing ionospheric heater with 1/4 of its power near Tromsø in northern Norway, known as AISCAT. This is a joint scientific and military system, which is now being upgraded further to AISCAT 3D.
Some people have obviously heard of HAARP, which was around in the late 80s, I believe. That was a form of ionospheric heating. But ESCAT was a phased array isophonic heater in the Arctic Circle in Norway in 1980. This was one of the smaller versions of such, but was still powerful enough to literally heat the ionosphere to a point whereby it would, anything that was passing under it would react. And what they discovered was that by doing this, and if anything passed underneath it, such as a low Earth orbit satellite, it would have effects on the satellite's not only positioning, but its trajectory, its speed, and it could potentially be slowed down.
IceCat is a phased array ionospheric heater in the Arctic Circle, where the electrojet is close to the Earth, the same electrojet that is the power source for the Earth energy system. Phased array antenna systems are active antennas which transmit their signals in a typically narrow beam, which is steered by the careful computerized timings of the radio signals reaching the antennas. The transmitted beam can be swept very quickly and accurately, far more so than with mechanically steered antennas. To be effective, the atmosphere would need to be lifted to meet the tracked satellite over many passes, probably over 2 or 3 days. Each slowing would fractionally alter its re-entry envelope until the satellite would be on a dedicated course to re-enter, hopefully somewhere near the area you want it to. This would be a very clever thing to do accurately. There would be a reasonably large area of uncertainty of its final trajectory, even with the most accurate of braking. You would need to track it to the ground and be ready to recover it quickly from land or sea. To recover from the sea, you would also prefer a shallow section of sea, such as the North Sea. What would you use to track the final part of the re-entry accurately? If this was the southeast coast of England, you would have a good choice of air sector radars. They are everywhere. There was the Master Radar Station, MSR, at RAF Neatishead, with similar range of equipment to RAF Bawdsey, most noticeably an FPS-6 height-finding radar, a Type 84 linesman, and a Type 85 Blue Yeoman air defense radar. This would be fine for an object flying at the height of a normal aircraft, but what would be better would be a radar designed to track and guide a ground-launched missile to the edge of space and back down. 2 such radars were fitted at RAF Bawdsey in 1979. And not only was RAF Bawdsey the leading experimental radar research base in the UK, it is on the coast, only a few miles from RAF Woodbridge. Until the mid-1970s, RAF Bawdsey took over the MRS role from RAF Neatishead after a very serious fire there. When RAF Neatishead was rebuilt and back online, RAF Bawdsey was converted into a Bloodhound missile site. The Bloodhound Mk2 missiles installed there are guided by a powerful Type 87 Scorpion constant wave radar system. Most radars send out pulses, but a constant wave radar sends out a beam. If the 2 radar types were light sources instead of radio sources, then the pulsed systems would be like a flash gun for a camera. They would make an enormously bright flash many times a second, but in between flashes, there would be times of no light, so the average light output power would be much less than the peak's flash intensity. A CW, constant wave radar, would be like a searchlight. When it is in operation, it is on all the time. So, in operation, a pulsed radar would blind you, but a CW radar would cook you. In real terms, we are familiar with a domestic microwave oven, or radar range. They are typically magnetron devices of around 750 watts. A Type 87 radar, if it operated at the same frequency as a microwave oven, would be the equivalent of 800 microwave ovens, which instead of transmitting the energy into a metal box a foot or so away, transmitted it in a searchlight-type beam for over 300 miles. This would be powerful enough to cause plasma effects if focused at a relatively short range. It would also be ideal for feeding and steering targeting plasmas for phase conjugate directed energy weapons, such as in the Star Wars weapons program, as well as a remote power charging system for unmanned UAV aircraft.
Winston Keech describes how you would potentially slow any satellite down or create effects whereby anyone monitoring a satellite may think that there's some kind of electrical failure that's causing problems with it. This was, according to Winston Keech, quite a good way of disguising the fact that someone else could be messing with it when the owners of such technology may just think there's an electrical problem within the system itself. Now he describes again how the potential of using ionospheric heating on slowing this and bringing it down, but he also tries to highlight that what would you actually use to track the final part of the re-entry accurately to know where it was coming down. It was the possibilities, he said, was that there could have been an RAF Neatishead that was involved, but what he highlights is the fact that it would be great to use Neatishead for sort of the height of a normal aircraft, but what radar will be better that is designed to track and guide a grounded launching missile to the edge of space and back down, because we're talking about low Earth orbit here. The types of radars that would have been used would have actually been stationed in Bawdsey. They were stationed there in 1979 as part of the Bloodhound missile site, the Bloodhound Mk2 missiles that were installed there. And these were actually guided by a powerful Type 87 Scorpion constant wave radar system, which would have been ideal to actually fix onto the object and track exactly where it was going and where it would end up.
I believe Winston Keech thinks that all these high-power radars might have interacted with a much more fundamental force that has always been present in Suffolk. So, did humans unintentionally unleash a bigger force of nature during their human activity at downing a Soviet spy satellite.
If local Earth energy became entrained through the electrical earthing of the system, because of the continuous energy flow of the transmitter, then if a plasma was generated in the local atmosphere, not only would the tracking motions of the radar sweep the glowing plasma around the sky in that area, theoretically right down to ground level, but it would also phase conjugate the Earth energy to that focus point of the plasma in a process known as a four-way mixer. This would deliver concentrated Earth energy to that remote point, just like a directed energy weapon delivering a laser or maser blast. Not only would this energize the plasma and any object that the plasma contacts, but if that object or sufficiently charged plasma moved close enough to the ground, there would be something very much like a lightning strike to ground. The dripping molten metal effect described is also a plasma optical effect caused by electron bunching in conductive plasma channels, a little bit like the streamer conduction channels that open up the air to trigger a lightning flash.
Both the first night, but more the third night, in the sky, there were these blue lights flying around. Now, on the first night, the blue lights were more down on the ground in the vicinity of whatever we saw. I have to call it some kind of object, but it was more like lights. But on the third night, there was a lot of activity in the sky with the blue lights moving around. And at the time, we couldn't understand how that could be taking place. Never mind what we encountered both nights with different people. For me, both the first and the third night, but also what the blue lights were doing and the capabilities of it. Never mind if you listen to the Halt tape, he talks about them flying around on the tape, and then one of them comes right at him and beams the light down in the general direction of his feet. So we didn't understand that at that point. And that was, you can chalk that up that if we don't think we have the capabilities, where did they come from? That's just, to me, is what's going on today, and a lot of this stuff that's being seen. The people that are seeing it don't understand how far advanced our technologies come. But that's what we were seeing. That's what was taking place with these blue lights. And on night 3, I was observed going into a larger spear type, object that may have been a time dilation bubble. And when I went into it, I disappeared briefly.
It was anticipated that the Soviets would try to retrieve or destroy the Zenit satellite. This can be seen by positioning HMS Norfolk near the coast to give a radius of detection protection from Soviet submarines and surface craft. A Russian frogman that was captured in the local woodland would suggest that this was only partially effective. Meanwhile, a Soviet aircraft given the code name Bear G would be patrolling for up to 20 hours at a time in international waters off the coast. It may even have had a Bear D Elint companion for RT intercept and coordination. The job of the Bear G would be to use its long-range radar-guided anti-ship missiles to destroy the Zenith if it was seen to be on a splashdown descent off the coast. There are no reports of explosions at sea for the RFI incident that I know of, so this implies that the Zenit came down on land. Hence, a frogman was sent ashore. The 67th would have carried the Zenit away very quickly. They are experts at such recoveries. Charlie Wicker was the 67th ARS commander and was an expert in recovering downed satellites. Also note, witnesses reported seeing something being transported via helicopter, damaging the runway lights.
Well, there was actually 2 pararescue units in our vicinity. There was one up at Lake and Mildenhall, and then Woodbridge had a large detachment. It was called the 67th AARS. And they went by pararescue. And their job mostly was, in the event of a war, they would be out there rescuing the pilots both on land and sea if a plane was shot down. And in peacetime, if a plane crashed, either land or sea, they would be the first ones that would scramble a chopper to the area. Now, at Bentwaters, we had several incidents where planes actually crashed. One time, 2 crashed into each other, and one of the pilots had to eject into the ocean. But what I wasn't aware of, I was an airman at the time, but it was later discovered, was they also were involved in the Apollo program that was no longer in existence. So they would have been used to recover, if they would have landed out in the ocean or the North Sea area on a burn, they would have recovered the Apollo crews. And they also, the 67th Commander was an expert in recovering down satellites. And he got that training and did some of that during the Vietnam War. So that unit was well versed in doing all this. And on the particular night, there were different people that reported helicopters in the air. Now, the interesting thing about that was Colonel Halt said that nothing was leaving the Woodbridge base at the time. I'm not sure whether it was or not, but Rendlesham Heath had an airfield there, and they also could have been utilizing Lake and Heath Bentwaters, Lake and Heath Mildenhall, which by helicopter probably wasn't more than 20 minutes.
Winston Keech wants us to understand the advanced physics as well as the practical that happened in Rendlesham Forest. Physics is the new frontier of weapon systems post the Manhattan Project. So let's dive into that fascinating physics that the military was exploiting.
The last part relevant to the RFI is quantum tunneling. As we have seen, matter and energy can be largely interchangeable depending on when you are viewing them. As most people are familiar with matters as barriers, I will stick to that perspective. And linear time, people are more comfortable with that too. When a barrier at the quantum level experiences a wave striking it, the wave can either be absorbed or reflected. At a quantum level, there is a probability curve that can do a third thing. It can partly pass through the barrier. The higher the energy of the wave or particle and the thinner the barrier, the more passes through. This is called quantum tunneling. Our reality is actually multiplexed between many others. These are time, frequency, and phase division multiplexed so that they don't normally interact in a meaningful way. Basically, the fundamental parameters of the reality waves are used to squash as many independent reality signals into one reality beam as possible. The same techniques are used in telecommunications. It is how you send millions of data channels down an optic fiber without them interfering with each other. As coincidence would have it, fiber optic communications were developed and largely invented at BT Martlesham Heath, just a few miles from both RAF Bawdsey and RAF Woodbridge. It would seem that for the large-scale effects to apply reality physics engineering, you need radio and especially radar engineers and equipment. You need high-power, high-voltage DC pulses to displace the T2 phase. DC because we're in a modular math section of reality. But you need advanced telecommunications engineers to access the finer, wider detail because they are experts at multiplex systems and wave phase dispersion. To make matters more complex, the holographic sheet is also rolled up into a tube, so trans-dimensional distances to the periodic reappearances of parts of our linear timeline may be only micro-fine distances away if you could travel sideways trans-dimensionally. A lot of things do this, and I strongly suspect that the torsion field effect of the entrained ground energy during the RFI incident is what allowed something from a future point on a potential timeline to pop through. Resonant coupling of energy matter from both sides of the barrier until the entire energy matter from the somewhere else tunneled through the natural energetic barrier between it and us. It may even have been engineered to do that and would effectively have been a portable tunnel to other reality frames, a bit like the extending corridor from an airport to an airplane. Similarly, the corridor does not define the size of the airport it connects to, so a relatively small corridor could lead to a very large airport, except that in this case, the length of the tunnel might only be nanometers. So from the plane, you only see a corridor, but as soon as you step into it, you only see the airport. Now, to complete the context for Tesla's Teleforce, people only see this as an early particle beam weapon, analogous to a railgun, which is still pretty good going for 100 years ago. Tesla was a precise man, and one primarily interested in longitudinal EM waves. These are more like sound waves and have some very distinct properties from transverse EM waves. They are still just waves though, not magic. Tesla knew that these were shock waves rippling through the fabric of local space. He also saw that they passed straight through matter, so he will have realized that they are phase shifted during propagation and are only experienced as a localized self-collimated point of force, which has an energy equivalent to a particle and will not be a particle once more until it is phase shifted back to matter. That is why he named it teleforce. If you are going to easily engineer reality physics, this is a ready-made source of engineerable, higher-order phase-shifted energy. The processes he used to generate teleforce are directly comparable to processes using klystron systems to generate high-power radar. If you were going to attempt to develop technologies in this realm, you would start with a high-powered radar system and modify it. For instance, if you wanted to make a real, solid, holographic image, this is what you would use to project energy into the local information field to make that new piece of reality pop into existence. I feel that it is likely that this is what was being attempted at Montauk, and if you wanted to continue that line of experimental development, there would be no better place on Earth than Rendlesham Forest to do that. There would be the skills, expertise and equipment available all within a small geographical area. So maybe the effect wasn't as unexpected as I first thought. As an engineer, my thoughts would be to use such technology to make things appear. Food, clean water, Kim Wilde singing to Hendrix. But the military minds behind the clandestine development might have an interest beyond solid decoys. They might have wanted to use it to make things disappear too. It is a chilling thought.
You have to understand military history and how it's covered up. And what I mean by covered up, there's things that are going on right now that won't probably, no one will know about or even have an understanding of it for a decade or two. So back in 1980, there was a change from, conventional weapons, just like they did before. When World War I, they fought it on the ground. Then the airplane started being brought into it. World War II, the airplane advanced, the aircraft carrier advanced. And then after World War II, we had the Korean War, and then Vietnam, and then the Cold War was going on. Weapon systems advanced. And it's clear, based on the research that's been done by James and others, that was the hotbed for advanced physics, as far as physics being brought more and more into modern warfare and weaponization. It also had, in the area of phenomena that was being studied, to be integrated into all of these advanced weapons. And there's documents to support the fact that right at Rendlesham Heath, we were working on SDI. And now most people will say SDI didn't come out till Reagan brought it up. No, SDI was well in its advanced stages going back into the 60s and 70s. So it was an advancement of technology integrating advanced physics. And they were bringing online more advanced computers. Quantum physics was, starting to rear its head. So all this was coming together, and it all was coming together right outside the back gate at Woodbridge Airport.
But Winston Keech wants to go further. I think he believes that humans are like meddling children. Are we just beginning to mess around with the fundamental forces of nature? The Rendlesham Forest incident was probably just instigated by clever scientists, but it is more likely that whatever they unleashed has existed on our planet and in the universe for a very long time.
I hope this oversimplified explanation helped visualize the processes that could have occurred way beyond some simple Cold War shenanigans. I think it gives a good perspective of how little we really were despite all our bravado and arrogance when you realize that the very cutting edge of physics and engineering in 1980 was being produced naturally by nothing more than an old hill. However clever we think we are, nature has already done it and perfected it. But if we wake up and realize who and what we really are, then there are literally new dimensions of capability and experience for us to access. Bill Hicks, he got it. It's not difficult, really. Only people are difficult.
It's clear that at the time we would have had no idea how to put this all together. It took years. I mean, in fact, it took over 30 years before some of the pieces started becoming available through, declassified documents and FOIAs. But there's no doubt that what we've covered earlier in this series about Andrew Pike and his work down there with the phenomenon itself, what Project Condign talks about, what I observed in those fields over 2 nights, never mind the fact what I observed going forward in my military career. And interesting enough, at one point I've had an interaction with Colonel Halt recently where he said there's no doubt that some kind of testing and work was probably going on out there, but he also believes there was some kind of a natural or controlled, an intelligent phenomenon in the area also. And I think as we've gone along in this series and we'll go forward, we're going to provide that information based on what was available at the time as far as known about this phenomenon in the area, the technology that was there and that was, being utilized, the R&D and all the work. Never mind the energy sources were there, the computing power was there, the radar facilities that were there, and the specialists that were there, including SRI, that were all in the area at the time of our event. There's no doubt that both parts play a part in this. And there's no doubt to me also, Win Keech, based on his engineering background, has a very good understanding of what was going on. And when you go back to it, this area was the stepping stone for the technology that's being utilized today, the weaponization of UAPs. In closing, we've been doing a question and answer series from our last episode where questions came up about the video and what we're going to do forward. What I want to make perfectly clear is this, okay? This series is being driven by my desire to not only understand what happened to us, but also take a look and try to show the people what we experienced and how it affected our lives. And we put together a great team. James has done a ton of research that opened my eyes up to the capabilities in the area. Professor has a great scientific background that helps, put this all together. But at the end of the day, nothing that goes out there hasn't gone through me first. And what I mean by that, it's not being driven by the professor. It's not being driven by James. They're working with me, and I'm the one that's driving how this is presented, not them. They're working with me. They have ideas that they're putting into this. Their professor's doing a great job of putting this together. James is doing a great job of putting all his research out for people to see. But ultimately, it's not being driven by the professor. It's being driven by my desire to understand and put forth what happened to us. Because not only was I the victim of a Cold War, there were numerous other military personnel that were involved in this war also.
Well said, John, and it's a great honor and privilege to work with you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so proud that we made this film for you. Winston Keech's report on how to deorbit a satellite using our Norwegian ionospheric heater heating up the atmosphere sounds plausible. Using filing tails or Bordsy's Type 87 radar to actually knock out the electronics on a satellite, almost like a non-nuclear EMP pulse? Very possible at the time. And remember, Rendlesham Forest isn't in rural Suffolk. It's surrounded by MOD laboratories. Bordsey was the place that German continuous wave radar, the ones that produce Foo Fighters by ionization, were made more powerful by British boffins after World War II. So, was there a Soviet spy satellite deliberately deorbited into Suffolk? I really don't know. But there's a lot of evidence that the technology existed in 1980 to actually carry out that mission. What I do know is that US service personnel encountered the highly strange in Rendlesham Forest. Whatever it was they saw, the satellite mission is only a tiny part of a much bigger picture. Multiple witnesses experienced strange and damaging effects on those fateful nights in December 1980. The disturbing truth is men and women were injured. Thank you very much for watching this Cold War spy drama in rural Suffolk. Please press like to tell YouTube this is the type of film that you enjoy, and consider subscribing for more mysteries from history. But remember, the truth is out there.